France was gone, not defeated on paper, but crushed in spirit. In just 6 weeks, the French army, the same force that had bled at Verdun and held back Germany in 1914, had been torn apart by Hitler's blitzkrieg. The generals who had once sworn that the Maginot Line was impregnable watched in disbelief as German tanks simply rolled around it. Town after town fell without warning. Sedan, Reims, Amiens, Lille, names that once carried pride, now whispered with shame. By June 1940, the tricolor no longer flew over Paris. The Eiffel Tower stood under a new flag, red, white, and black, with a swastika twisting in the summer wind. German boots echoed down the Champs-Élysées, and the cafes that once smelled of coffee and cigarettes now reeked of fear and silence. French policemen saluted German officers. The newspapers printed victory speeches from Berlin. The voice on the radio was no longer French. It was the language of the conqueror. In the countryside, families huddled in barns, listening to distant trucks and gunfire, wondering if the war had truly ended. For them, the fall of France wasn't just the loss of a nation, it was the death of certainty. Farmers buried their radios, teachers burned their books, and priests replaced sermons with silence. Every word was dangerous now. Every stranger could be a collaborator. The government that fled to Vichy called it the New France, but the people knew better. They called it what it was – surrender wrapped in speeches. Marshal Pétain told the country that resistance was hopeless, that the nation must learn to work with the victor. He said France had been betrayed by modernity, by democracy, by itself. He promised order, morality, and obedience, and millions, too exhausted to argue, believed him. But not all. Somewhere in that silence, small voices began to whisper. Railroad workers, teachers, doctors, priests, old soldiers, people who couldn't accept that France's story had ended. They watched the Germans march, watched their leaders kneel, and felt something twist inside them. Across the Channel, Britain had refused to surrender. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped at Dunkirk, leaving their guns, trucks, and dead behind. To most of the world, it looked like the end. But then something happened, something no one expected. Instead of asking for peace, Churchill told Britain to fight on. He said they would never surrender. He said that even if the island fell, they would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, in the streets. And in the dark cellars and attics of occupied France, people listened. They turned the dials of forbidden radios until the static gave way to a faint, crackling English voice carried by the BBC. It was defiance transmitted across the Channel, a promise that the war was not over, that France had not been forgotten. For many, that was the first spark, because if Britain refused to kneel, maybe France could stand again too. The first sparks of resistance did not come with grand speeches or armies of men. They came in whispers, in hidden meetings, in the quiet scratching of pens on paper. In Paris, in the quiet corridors of the Musée de l'Homme, a handful of museum workers and academics began to talk. Among them was 22-year-old Inez Humbar, an art historian who had once spent her days cataloging paintings and sculptures, now stood in a city that felt emptied of life. Every morning she walked the streets and saw the same hollow faces, the same bent heads moving quickly to avoid German patrols. Fear was everywhere, and yet it was not enough for her to think, "We cannot surrender too." The Musée de l'Homme group was not trained for war. They carried no weapons. They had no secret codes or military strategy. What they had, and what they would soon learn was more dangerous and more powerful, was conviction. They had heard Churchill's words. They had listened to de Gaulle's first broadcasts from London, stiff and formal but resolute. They had seen that someone, somewhere, refused to accept that Europe had already fallen. That refusal became their blueprint. If Britain could resist against impossible odds, then they could resist in their own way.
Meetings were held at night. They whispered in back rooms and under the arches of the museum, pretending to catalog artifacts while sharing intelligence, news, and ideas. Every visitor to the museum could be a spy, every passerby a potential betrayer. The air was heavy with tension, every word a potential death sentence. Yet in that danger, their resolve hardened. Boris Vilde, a Russian-born ethnographer who had made France his home, reminded them constantly, "If the British can fight, then we are not alone in refusing to accept this." Their first acts of defiance were small, almost imperceptible. Leaflets smuggled into Parisian streets, signed anonymously, claiming that the war was not over. Notes slipped into pockets of workers and students, urging them to believe in a future where France could fight back. Every act was a risk. Every hand that touched the paper could be arrested, tortured, or killed. But the flame, once lit, could not be extinguished. Outside the museums, other pockets of resistance were forming. In Lyon, in Marseille, and Toulouse, teachers and priests began organizing small networks. Ex-soldiers trained in the old wars, veterans of Verdun and the Great War, quietly met in barns and cellars. They taught civilians how to read maps, how to spot patrols, how to communicate secretly. In Paris, young men and women began cataloging German troop movements, memorizing uniforms, noting railway schedules. Every small observation was intelligence. Every whispered warning could save lives. The British refusal to surrender became a psychological anchor. Every day that London remained unbroken, every broadcast that reached French ears, became proof that resistance was possible. Lucy Ora, a young teacher in Lyon, listened nightly to the BBC with her husband Raymond. They heard about bombers falling over Britain, about civilians hiding in London's underground stations, about pilots and soldiers defying death to defend a small island. "Every night Britain refused to bow," Lucy would whisper, "is a night that proves Pétain was wrong." It was this proof, this living example of defiance, that transformed despair into purpose. Resistance was not abstract anymore. It was tangible. It was actionable. It was proof that courage was possible, even when all logic said surrender was inevitable. France was occupied. France was wounded. But France, they realized, could still fight, and if it could fight, they would. By late summer 1940, the network of resistors was still fragile, but alive. Leaflets called resistance circulated in secret. People risked everything to hide radios, to pass messages, to carry intelligence to London through perilous routes. And through all this, the BBC remained a lifeline, a steady voice across the channel, reminding them that someone still refused to surrender, and that refusal could be contagious. Resistance did not yet mean sabotage, arrests, or daring attacks. It meant belief. Belief in a France that could rise again. Belief that surrender was not the only option. Belief that courage could outlive fear. And for those first resistors, Agnès, Boris, Jean Cassou, Lucy Ora, and the others, that belief would become the foundation of everything that followed. Without it, the fire of French resistance might never have ignited. Words were powerful, but they were only the beginning. By the autumn of 1940, the members of the fledgling resistance realized that words alone would not be enough to confront the occupiers. The Musée de l'Homme group, along with similar cells in Lyon, Marseille, and Toulouse, began taking the first steps towards organized action. They were amateurs in every sense: teachers, historians, museum curators, clerks, former soldiers and students, people who had never held a gun in combat or planned a military operation. Yet their passion and intelligence made up for their lack of experience. They knew that every small action, every piece of information, every act of defiance had the potential to undermine the German occupation in ways that could ripple far beyond their immediate surroundings.
Intelligence gathering became one of their first priorities. Groups began memorizing troop movements, cataloging railway schedules, noting the arrival and departure of trains carrying German soldiers, weapons, and supplies. Young students risked walking past checkpoints, carrying messages written in code on scraps of paper, disguised as ordinary homework. Artifacts in the museums were no longer just historical relics. They became hiding places for radios, leaflets, and weapons. Boris Vildé and Ernest Humbert coordinated carefully, training others to read maps, to observe without being noticed, to speak in hushed tones that concealed more than just fear. They concealed strategy. At the same time, leaflets and clandestine newspapers multiplied. The simple act of distributing written words in the streets of occupied France was a revolutionary act. Handed to a stranger in a cafe, dropped through a mailbox, or left on a park bench, these pamphlets spread news of British resistance, stories of courage, and messages that defied the narrative of surrender. They reminded the French population that Hitler had not yet won, and that defiance was still possible. The title of their first publication, Résistance, was simple yet profound. It declared a choice: to resist, to reject defeat, and to hold on to hope. The example of Britain continued to guide them. Every BBC broadcast became more than news. It was instruction, inspiration, and proof. As the Battle of Britain began in July 1940 and German bombers darkened the skies over London, French resistors listened intently. Reports of civilian courage in the face of bombardment, of pilots fighting despite overwhelming odds, of Churchill refusing every offer of peace, all became psychological weapons in themselves. The message was clear: defiance was possible, even when the logical, safe choice seemed to be surrender. For Ernest Humbert, Lucy Ora, and countless others, hearing about Britain's perseverance turned fear into determination. They knew that if Britain could survive alone, then their resistance in occupied France could also survive and even flourish. Training and organization slowly followed. Former military officers taught civilians how to hide radios, how to recognize the uniforms and insignia of the occupiers, and how to communicate securely. Small sabotage operations were tested, cutting telephone wires, marking German convoys for observation, and leaving coded messages for Allied intelligence. Each success, each undetected operation reinforced the idea that they were not powerless, that their choices mattered. The resistance was growing quietly but steadily, fueled by a mixture of courage, necessity, and inspiration drawn from across the Channel. The stakes were brutal. Every operation carried the threat of arrest, torture, or execution. By the end of 1940, the Gestapo began making arrests, and the first members of the Musée de l'Homme network were captured. Ernest Humbert, Boris Vildé, and others were imprisoned, interrogated, and in some cases, executed. But even as they were taken away, the work they had begun did not die. The flame of resistance they had ignited spread to other cities, inspiring new cells and networks, each learning from the sacrifices of the first. The courage of Britain, the broadcasts of Churchill, and the determination of de Gaulle provided the psychological backbone that kept these movements alive. By the winter of 1940, what had begun as a handful of individuals refusing to surrender became a network of resistance groups united by a common principle: France was not defeated because Britain had not surrendered. Every clandestine message, Every hidden radio, every daring escape helped forge the foundation of a movement that would one day rise across France in coordinated rebellion. The resistors understood that they were building something larger than themselves, a moral and strategic lifeline that would eventually connect with the Allied forces. And all of it began with a simple act of belief. If Britain could refuse to surrender, then France could too.
Defiance came at an extraordinary cost. By late 1940 and into 1941, the Gestapo intensified its campaign to crush resistance networks, and the personal dangers for every resistor became painfully real. Agnès Humbert, Boris Wilde, and many of their colleagues in the Musée de l'Homme group learned that courage alone was not enough to guarantee survival. The Gestapo was relentless, using informants, surveillance, and brutal interrogation techniques to break the fledgling networks. Members were hunted like animals, arrested in the dead of night, and subjected to days or weeks of questioning designed to instill fear and betrayal. Some cracked under the pressure, others held firm, often knowing that their refusal to speak might cost them their lives. The stakes could not have been higher, and yet, despite these mortal threats, the resistance did not collapse. Every arrest sent ripples of fear through the clandestine groups. When Boris Wilde was captured and executed in February 1942, it sent a chilling message. The price of resistance was death. Yet paradoxically, these sacrifices fueled determination in others. Each loss became a symbol of courage, a reminder that surrender was not the only choice. Agnès Humbert endured years in German labor camps, subjected to malnutrition, forced labor, and constant surveillance. Her body was broken, her spirit tested to its limits, yet the memory of Britain's refusal to surrender and de Gaulle's early broadcast sustained her. The idea that defiance was possible, that resistance could exist even in the face of overwhelming power, became a mantra for those still free, guiding their actions and decisions. Resistance networks, while constantly under threat, began to expand, adapt, and become more sophisticated. Groups that started with simple observation, leaflets, and radios now undertook organized sabotage, intelligence gathering, and the coordination of escape routes for Allied soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. Weapons, explosives, and funds were smuggled in by British and Free French agents via parachute drops. Communication codes were developed to protect identities, and cells operated independently to minimize the damage if one was compromised. These networks were as much psychological as physical. They reinforced the belief that France had not surrendered, that every small act of defiance was a contribution to a much larger struggle, and that hope, though fragile, could survive in occupied territory. The BBC broadcasts remained central to this moral and strategic structure. Every speech from Churchill, every update on British resilience, every report of RAF victories or civilian endurance under bombardment became a psychological weapon against despair. People like Lucy O'Bra and Jean Cassou tuned in nightly, risking arrest, and absorbed not just facts but a philosophy that defiance was possible even when the world seemed lost. They shared what they heard with neighbors, colleagues, and clandestine networks, ensuring that even in areas far from London, the example of Britain became a lifeline, a proof that resistance could work. The narrative was simple yet profound. Surrender is a choice. Defiance is also a choice, and those who choose courage can shape history. Yet this courage came with personal and moral complexity. Resistors constantly weighed the safety of their families against the necessity of action. Some lost friends or relatives to betrayal or arrest. Some were halted by the knowledge that a single misstep could lead to the destruction of entire cells. The very act of resistance demanded sacrifice, patience, and careful calculation. And yet, even under constant threat, these early French resistors remained motivated not just by anger or nationalism, but by the tangible evidence that someone across the channel refused to accept defeat. Britain's unwavering stand transformed what might have been despair into purpose, showing that defiance could exist and even thrive under seemingly impossible conditions. By 1942, these networks were no longer isolated. They had become the backbone of a burgeoning underground army. Small groups were connecting, exchanging intelligence, coordinating sabotage, and preparing for a future that seemed unimaginable in June 1940. They were no longer only academics, curators, or teachers. They were soldiers in a war fought in shadow, armed with courage, ingenuity, and the belief that the future of France was not yet decided. Every broadcast from London, every scrap of news about British victories or stubborn defiance, every message from de Gaulle's Free French Command reinforced the psychological foundation of their struggle. Without Britain's refusal to surrender, the moral justification for risking everything might never have existed. The flame of resistance had been lit by those first voices of defiance, and even as the Gestapo sought to snuff it out, it continued to burn, spreading quietly but inevitably across France. By 1943, what had begun as isolated acts of courage and clandestine defiance had grown into a sprawling, decentralized network of resistance cells across France, united not by a single ideology, but by a shared refusal to accept German occupation and the Vichy government's collaboration. These cells, diverse in political background and social class, were linked by one common inspiration – Britain's refusal to surrender after Dunkirk and the symbolic leadership of Charles de Gaulle. While the BBC continued to broadcast coded messages, Churchill's speeches, and the reports of Britain's endurance under the Blitz, British intelligence and the Special Operations Executive actively began equipping, training, and coordinating the French networks. Parachute drops delivered arms, explosives, funds, and radios to groups operating under impossible conditions, often in rural barns, deserted factories, or hidden rooms in urban centers. Each delivery was a lifeline, a tangible reinforcement of the psychological message that defiance could translate into action and ultimately success. The transformation of these networks from isolated actors into a coordinated underground army was neither fast nor easy. Communication had to be clandestine, operational security paramount, and trust carefully managed. Yet inspired by the knowledge that Britain's example proved resistance was possible, they developed strategies that would maximize their impact. Intelligence on German troop movements, railway schedules, and supply lines was meticulously gathered and passed along to Allied planners in London. Sabotage operations disrupted German logistics, delayed reinforcements, and created openings for Allied offensives. Every action, no matter how small, carried weight. Every successful sabotage was proof that the occupiers were not invincible. Individuals who had been mere observers in 1940, museum curators, teachers, students, and office workers, became operatives capable of feats of audacity. Lucy Aubrac, who had once listened to the BBC in her apartment in Lyon, was now orchestrating escape routes for downed Allied airmen, smuggling weapons and messages, and coordinating attacks that would directly support the Allied invasion. Jean Cassou, formerly a literature professor, became a key intelligence coordinator, translating coded messages and mapping German deployments. The courage and initiative that had been sparked by Britain's refusal to surrender now manifested in concrete, dangerous action. For them, resistance was not a symbolic gesture. It was a matter of life, death, and the future of France. The French resistance's relationship with Britain was multifaceted. The SOE not only provided equipment but also guidance, training, and tactical advice. Yet the resistors were fiercely independent, unwilling to surrender their initiative or national dignity, just as they had refused surrender to the Germans. De Gaulle, operating from London, became both a moral and operational focal point, ensuring that resistance was not just about surviving occupation but preparing for liberation. Coordination between London and the underground networks created a synergy. The resistors disrupted German forces from within, and the Allies exploited these disruptions during major operations, most notably the Normandy landings of June 1944. Every railway cut, every communication line severed, every sabotage of supply depots directly eased the path of the Allied advance, proving that a network of civilians, motivated by defiance and inspired by Britain's stand, could alter the course of a war.
Even as the Gestapo intensified repression with arrests, executions, and infiltration, the psychological foundation of the resistance held firm. The memory of Britain refusing to surrender, of London's radio broadcasts piercing the darkness of occupation, became a mantra and a promise. Resistance was not futile, defiance was possible, liberation could be achieved. Those early moments when people like Anis Humbert, Boris V., Lucy Aura, and Jean Cassou first chose to defy the surrender of France now rippled across the entire movement. By 1944, these acts of courage had multiplied into a nationwide effort, each cell a spark connected to countless others, each operation a testament to the power of hope, defiance, and the enduring human will to fight even when the odds seemed insurmountable. By June 1944, the French resistance had evolved from fragmented, secretive groups into a coordinated underground force capable of directly influencing the outcome of the war. The D-Day landings at Normandy marked the turning point. Resistance fighters who had spent 4 years gathering intelligence, sabotaging German supply lines, and guiding Allied soldiers through occupied territory, now emerged from the shadows to actively support the invasion. Railways were cut, bridges demolished, communication lines destroyed, and German units ambushed, each act delaying reinforcements and easing the path for the Allies. The courage that had first been sparked by Churchill's refusal to surrender now had a tangible effect on the battlefield. The resistors were no longer merely inspired by hope, they were a decisive factor in France's liberation. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 stands as the ultimate testament to this courage. Citizens, emboldened by years of quiet defiance and the example set by Britain, rose up alongside the resistance fighters. Streets that had been silent under occupation erupted with action. Barricades were raised, and battles waged against German forces as Allied troops approached. It was a collective effort born from years of risk, sacrifice, and the unwavering belief that surrender was not inevitable. For those who had heard the BBC broadcasts in 1940, who had followed every speech by Churchill and every appeal by de Gaulle, this moment was proof that their defiance had meaning. The choices made in the darkest hours to resist, to continue, to fight when all seemed lost, had shaped the course of history. The legacy of the French resistance extends far beyond military victories. It is a story of ordinary people transformed by extraordinary courage, by the power of example, and by the psychological impact of hope in the face of despair. Anis Humbert survived labor camps, returning to France to write her memoir, Resistance, documenting how the refusal of Britain to surrender inspired a nation to defy occupation. Lucy Aura, Jean Cassou, Boris V., and countless others, many of whom gave their lives, demonstrated that defiance is contagious, that when one nation chooses not to give up, it can ignite the courage of another. Britain's decision after Dunkirk was not just a military act, it was a psychological lifeline, proving that even in the bleakest hour, surrender was not the only option. By the end of the war, France was free, but the memory of those early days remained etched in the hearts of its people. The flame of resistance, kindled by hope and sustained by defiance, became a symbol of national resilience. The French resistance had shown the world that courage is not just measured by armies or weapons, but by the unyielding determination to fight for what is right, even when all seems lost. And it all began with a simple, defiant no from across the Channel. Britain would not surrender. From that refusal sprang the hope, the courage, and the action that would restore France's freedom and honor. In the end, the French resistance proved that defiance, when rooted in conviction and inspired by example, can change the course of history.